All right, so in this section of Endnotes is a long essay on the history of the workers' movement. They continue to refer to the relevance, the undying control that the quote old regime has on the workers' movement and on society in general. The old regime being represented by the aristocracy, the pre-capitalist aristocracy that eventually through the pseudo bourgeois revolution was transformed into the bourgeois class, the class that owned the means of production, and the bourgeois class being the aristocracy of capitalism. But we were just discussing billionaires. It's one
Mm-hmm.
of our preferred topics that we like to talk about. Is we just like to gossip about billionaires, and
Yeah.
billionaires really represent the continued relevance, the undying grasp of the old regime on you know new societies, even as society changes in ever new ways, in ever new directions. The old regime lives on, its lick grasp strangling the breath of the working class. It used to be in the form of kings and emperors and whatnot, and then it became the form of like um, old like industrialists and like just that old-fashioned vision of the like self-made kind of capitalist class bourgeoisie, which is really just a transplantation of the aristocracy. The aristocracy are the ones who made up the initial ranks of the bourgeoisie, and then it became like corporations themselves and like individuals were kind of supplanted for a while. They became invisible, but now we're just back at like the first stage in the cycle. Just like fashion, everything is cyclical, and we just have a bunch of god emperors again. We just have a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of self-made, like self-mythologizing, quote self-made, like heroic individuals who have managed to according to their own legends, like pull themselves up from nothing and create these vast stores of capital and these vast like infrastructures of profit generating like industries in order to continually hold back the development of humanity. It's a pretty fucked up situation. I've heard that in fact, technologically, we're like hundreds of years behind where we would be if it were not for these um, corporations, these people, and the people behind them who are profiting from the corporations, um, like wanting to slow down the progress of technology in order to be able to commodify it at every stage. Like in order to be able to release a new phone every year, Apple can only develop the cellular technology at such a rate. But if we were not, held back by that kind of interest, then who knows where cell phones would be. If
Yeah.
we're not held back by the interests of the gas companies, of the fuel lobby, then who knows where like renewable technology would be at this point. Um, but we're also discussing another type of billionaire. Um, that being, I don't even know if he's a billionaire, but James Cameron, he's at least like a leader of men, in the same way that all these like business men like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Elon Musk and George Soros, I guess, and the Koch brothers and all the rest of them lead men in some limited sense. They don't really, but to some extent they do. Um, James Cameron and other like film directors, James Cameron just being like the biggest example of that, lead people on their film sets, but in a more like direct way. You know, they have to actually supervise and oversee the productive labor of, you know, in James Cameron's case, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people on a smaller film set. You know, it could be just like 10 or 20 on like a regular one. We're getting up to hundreds of people working on a film set that are all under the supervision. It's bureaucratized. Like you have assistant directors and like assistants and like ADs and whatnot. But all of these people, ultimately, their decisions are, you know, overseen and given final say by the filmmaker, by the director. Um, and you know, sometimes that is not always true. Like the producer will have a say as well. But in Cameron's case, he is also the producer of his films. He directs, writes, produces, in some cases, edits, does like music and kind of sound design for all of his movies. And he at least has like a direct hand in all of those different aspects of the film, which I think is you know, very interesting. He is like um, a much better example of somebody who like he's like a more real inheritor of the old regime, of like a lord who, you know, had to who is like invested in the productive capacity of the peasants living on his land. You know, the lord, his income came from, you know, the peasants output. Like the lord didn't actually do any farming. He didn't have any um like the lord's like real like power comes from the military, like his soldiery, and his soldiers were not doing any farming. Like he could only get his food from the peasants on his land via the soldiers, but he didn't have any kind of like direct access to a food source. So in that way, like the lord becomes like a more directly invested manager and overseer of the labor of the people on his land, who are, you know, doing this labor that is very important, that sustains the lord, and like directly, because, you know, the lord needs to eat, but also sustains his power because, you know, the lord's soldiers also need to eat. So I think, you know, like in that sense, like the feudal lord is you know, very directly involved in the labor of the peasant population, in the same way that you know, James Cameron is very directly involved in the labor of his peasantry.
But yeah, this idea of like feudal lords, I guess like this has been kind of a meme lately that I've seen a few people talking about this idea of neo-feudalism. I don't know a whole lot about it. I've been doing a little bit of reading on like OG feudalism, which I guess happened in a few different parts of the world. It's like not so much like a specific historical moment as kind of like a social form that arises under certain conditions. And it's kind of gotten me thinking about like just generally the idea of like feudalism and living under feudalism. And this is something I was talking about before we started recording, about how theoretically, and I'm not going to speak for everybody, I'm not even going to speak for most people, just me personally, I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea of living under like a feudal lord or a ruling class if they were like a visionary. Like, honestly, that seems like kind of a sweet deal if they were just like, you know what, like you're going to be a peasant farmer and like you're just going to live on this plot of land and like you just kind of do your thing and you give me like a percentage of it and it's going to be a fair percent because I know that I can't like just take all your stuff or else you'll starve to death. Like, you know, you're basically like my investment, so I'm going to like only take so much so that you can like live yourself. And you know what, you just do that and I'll take care of all the like the difficult stuff, like making sure that like barbarians don't invade and like, kill your family. I'll take care of that. I got you, fam. And if they had like a nice castle or something and it had like a good aesthetic, I'd be into that. And I feel like there's maybe some people who'd be into that. The problem with like feudal lords under capitalism is that they're kind of blind to their role. They're just like these like parasitic money accumulators, or at least historically that's what they've been. Like they have no vision, they have no ambition, they have no like great sense of style that they want to impart to the world. They're not artistes.
I find the idea extremely repugnant. I guess mostly, primarily, well, for many different reasons, but a lot of it has to do with like the idea of like giving myself to somebody like Elon Musk, who is like the most disgusting and like low down vermin on the earth. Like every one of these billionaires are absolute like scum of the earth, like worst examples of humanity. They have absolutely no culture, they have no class, they have no taste, they have no vision that I would ever want to get behind. Like their vision. Have you ever fucking seen the Cybertruck? Like it is the worst aesthetic nightmare. It's such a piece of trash. Like, and that is how like Elon Musk's like Australia or whatever
Mm.
would look like. I would never want to live in that kind of
Well,
land. It's
that's
absolutely disgusting to me.
that's the problem that I was saying. I was like, theoretically, I'd be into the idea. The problem is that under capitalism, the kind of people who get to be in that position where they theoretically could do that are like either just like, the most like sociopathic, like finance bro, like Wolf of Wall Street types, or they're these just like complete like scientific materialists, like tech nerds who have like no kind of like like greater vision beyond just like we're gonna make like better iPhones and like robots and stuff. So like this is just a thought experiment for me. Like when you were talking about James Cameron, I was thinking like, yeah, it'd be kind of cool if someone with like a creative vision actually had like that degree of like potential for like social control. Whereas in the current infrastructure that we have, like the people who actually get in those positions of having control are like the actual billionaires we see. Like I would not want to have like Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos as a feudal lord. So this is more just like an open-ended thought experiment, because I recognize the actual like elites that we have are not the kind of elites that I would want to live under. What I'm saying is I'm not fundamentally opposed to there being elites. It's just that the actual elites that we have in the real world are not the kind of people that I would want to have as my elites, hypothetically.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know why we even need to like posit such a thought experiment when we already have the um, hypothesis of communism, which is really the same thing. It's like kind of, but under democratic rule rather than the rule of the elites. Like, I don't think that any elite is going to be better at managing myself, my own personal life, than myself. Like, which is not to say that they wouldn't be better at managing like certain aspects of life, like the irrigation facilities or like the sanitation or whatever. But I don't want to like have my life determined by anybody other than myself, frankly.
Mm.
um, or like the kind of like a virtuous kind of exemplar that I have like set up as my teacher in young age, or that has been set up. Anyway, I am a virtue ethicist, so I think that you should kind of have some kind of like exemplar, some kind of like paragon of virtue that kind of teaches you virtue from a young age. But it's not really something that you can choose, and certainly not something that any kind of like technocratic capitalist kind of billionaire is going to exemplify. And like I think like capitalism and virtue are kind of like contradictory qualities.
Yeah, that's like, to me that raises a question, because like I guess like I'm getting at when I'm thinking of like the idea of like a feudal lord is like, okay, like it doesn't have to be a person, but basically when you want to have like some sort of like organized society, there needs to be like some sort of thing that they're organizing around. Like it could be a ruler, it could be like, you know, a religion, it could be some sort of ethical code, like, okay, these are the rules of our society, like we're democratic, we're going to vote on things, like you can't do this to people, you should do this to people, blah blah blah. Or it could be something like, you know, liberalism, where it's kind of just like, okay, here's some basic rules, but basically it's like every man for himself, and we're just going to kind of put you all on like a playing field and see what happens. And like theoretically, like it'll stay like that, but in actuality, it quickly like power concentrates to like a few players. Um, so what I'm wondering is like, I think this is a big question of communization, is like, you know, because I think like in the 19th and the early 20th century, like there was this attempt by these workers' movements to create a central pillar out of like the idea of the worker, like the worker as like this like social idea that you could build an entire society around that would be more egalitarian. It would be like interlocking. It would be like a well-oiled machine. Everybody would be working together. There was like this promotion of like what that ideal worker would look like. And the vision was is that eventually all of society's roles would be done by some variation of these workers, which would have different roles, and they would, you know, be different genders, different races, whatever. But like they would all like have this underlying like worker logic that would like, you know, interlock together in some like grand like communist like society without like a central ruler. It would just be kind of like this like, you know, perpetual motion machine, because like everybody would be on the same page. And the project of communization is recognizing like how that did not happen, at least on like a sustained global level. And the position we're in now is like that no longer seems like a potential, because like most people are not skilled workers, and like there's no longer this sense that like everyone will eventually become skilled workers and like be able to apply this logic to all areas of life. So the question becomes like, what is our central organizing theme? If it's not going to be like a monarch, if it's not going to be liberalism, if it's not going to be like, you know, a single like virtue code, because people are from like so many different groups and have so many different like motivations and like backgrounds and like historical experiences and whatever. If it's not going to be like a god, like what can we create in 2021 in the situation that we're in that will fill that role of like a sort of, you know, central identifying like thing to give us like a social cohesion beyond just like greed is good.
Right. Yeah, I'll just add to the list of things that it is not is Black identity, which was one of the main questions, at least one of the questions of the Brown v. Ferguson essay that we read a few episodes back from Volume 4 as well. One of the main questions there, or at least like one of the things being offered as a hypothesis that Endnotes seemed to not be down with, was the idea that, you know, in the midst of this like wave of rioting and like political mobilization, this movement, BLM, in its early formative days, on the basis of, you know, racial identity, like perhaps that would be enough, um, you know, to provide like the kind of basis for this this coming together that you're talking about, this unification that the worker's identity was insufficient for. I think, I mean, in that episode, I confess to having the same thought like last summer when this you know, big George Floyd protest was happening, like for months and months at a time. Um, you know, it's this thought that, you know, maybe like this is what is going to save us. It is like our unification around, you know, Black identity and the oppression of Black people by the police and whatnot, and solidarity with them as white people is how, you know, white people are able to figure into that. Um, but yeah, I think the criticism is something like it's still too diffuse or something, like it still doesn't, it's not really like an economic category or something. I don't really know. I mean, it is still, it's still too incoherent in as evidenced by the fact that it is able to unite, black billionaires, black middle class, and um, the actual like surplus population that was being brutalized by the police. Like the any kind of any kind of political movement that is able to unite all of these people is not going to actually have like an issue at its heart, at its core, that is capable of taking down capitalism. Like
Yeah.
the black billionaire class and the black middle class are not interested in taking down capitalism. So the fact that they're able to unite around this, black identity is evidence that that identity was not antagonistic to capital.
I think something that Endnotes mentioned in that essay, there is like this cynical point of view that's not entirely like false, that you see these kind of like these protest waves tend to happen in election years, and the American Democratic Party will kind of seize upon them and like position themselves as being like the answer. Like, and you saw this in 2020 where like a lot of like Joe Biden's campaign was just like, yeah, Trump's the problem. Trump's like a big old racist. Like, he's to blame for all of this. If you just elect me, like, everything will be better. Like, maybe not quite that explicitly, but like, this is kind of the position that like the Democratic Party takes. And then like, if they win the election, it's just business as usual for another 4 to 8 years. Like, there isn't like a real substantive like change in like the fundamental infrastructure. And it's like when all of these like big corporations on like social media, on Twitter or whatever, will like change their avatar to be like, a rainbow colored avatar, or like a Black Lives Matter avatar. And it's like, look, we're one of the good guys. We're showing our support, even though like they're using like slave labor basically in developing countries to like, I don't want to use the term developing countries. It's kind of a colonial term, but like,
Low
in like
GDP countries.
low GDP
Just
countries. Thank you. I caught myself there. They'll be using like essentially slave labor to manufacture their electronics, but then they like go on Twitter and they have like the BLM like avatar, and like, that's supposed to be enough to make you an ally just because you're doing the good optics. And it's like, it's all bullshit, basically. Like, you can't work with these people.
Yeah. I was going to say that Karl Marx is not a really good example of a revolutionary, because he is really like a theorist, and his best writings are about capitalism. They're not about organization or strategy or whatever. Like, he's not really influential in that way. Like, a better example is like your Lenin and your Mao, and you know they I mean, it's more difficult to say that they simply like caught on to something that was already, or like some kind of tendency that was already flowing. I guess it's more relevant. I mean, I guess it is still true in their cases. Both Lenin and Mao um, came to be as like political leaders in a situation, a context where there was already like a developing kind of like socialist movement, and they just like kind of joined in with it and like learned from it, and then also lent their particular skills as leaders to it in order to, and like thereby amplified it. Um, but they also, I mean, I feel like they pushed it in like very particular directions, such that both of them have like kind of like theoretical tendencies named after themselves. Like, you have your Marxism Leninism, and you have your Marxism Leninism Maoism. They both kind of like or like, I guess more aptly, your Mao Zedong thought. Um, Maoism, MLMism being something different. But they both kind of like had like their own particular kind of unique ideas. They both like came up with ideas about how things should be, and then applied them to society, managed to like get everybody on board with it, managed to get everybody to do it. um, So I don't know, like it's maybe I don't know, and maybe that is like their downfall. At least from the communization perspective, I can see how it would be because like those kinds of theoretical innovations that they are most associated with, like for example, the Vanguard Party, famously in the case of Lenin, it's an easy example, and that is like from the communization perspective, you could argue that the reason that Leninism or that the USSR failed to really do a real revolution, failed to abolish the value form or whatever, is because they didn't like sufficiently use democratic principles to come up with their like revolutionary theories or like their social formations. They instead kind of relied on this individual's idea of how things should be rather than all of society contributing and like reforming itself. Like communism is supposed to be it's supposed to be the self-emancipation of the proletariat. Um, but in the case of Leninism, it's really the emancipation of the proletariat by the Vanguard Party, who are, representatives of bourgeois ideology. Anyway, like it's really when you're talking at that level, which Marx also talks about, the kind of like development of human consciousness. When you are able to like um, bring in a theory of the development of knowledge over time and how human consciousness kind of develops over time in the way that Hegel did. Like Hegel's whole thing is that human knowledge is historically contingent and it's like historically developed. Like unlike Kant, who thought that every kind of individual is a unique knower and they like develop their knowledge on their own or whatever. Like every kind of subject is like kind of isolated to the extent that they don't participate in culture, that they do or do not participate in culture. But Hegel's whole thing is that like human consciousness kind of like develops historically. It is like necessarily tied up with history, and as history has unfolded, as time has developed from antiquity to the present, then so too human consciousness has also developed and like fundamentally changed. I mean, Hegel is teleological in a way that Marx is not. So he does kind of say that it has developed in a kind of like progressive sense. But human consciousness is developing as history is developing, as civilizations and cultures are developing, and the two are like necessarily connected. I mean, for Marx, it is human consciousness is like the product of the development of the material forces, and development here is taken in a non-teleological kind of ambiguous sense. So you could say that it's developing up or down. Personally, I think that it's developing down right now. Like we're not ascending to godhood. We're degenerating
In a
into
decline
barbarism.
phase,
Yeah,
by the
unless
looks
like
of
we're
it.
able to pull ourselves out of it. But like at that point, when you're when you have actually like connected um, the evolution, the change in human consciousness to the change in human history, and when you're like theory is able to like I don't know like necessarily entwine the two, then I think you have like attained the ultimate level of like perspective, such that you can like I don't know talk about history
Mm.
and make these kinds of historical theorizations that you're kind of talking about in a more like cohesive sense. Because like ultimately, I mean, the project would be to like do a kind of in tandem historical development of human consciousness and culture, and how like the two have changed from the beginning of recorded civilization. But in lieu of that, you could say that, at this given stage of history, then human consciousness is at this point, and kind of do your like little isolated study.
Mm.
um it's quite a tangent. um anyway, maybe we should move into the essay at this point.
They do not reference Hegel at all in this essay, as far as
I like to think that he's secretly referenced.
He was up in a
It goes
cloud
without saying.
smiling as they wrote
It
this
goes
essay.
without saying. Yeah. So we are kind of reading the infrastructure and fracturing sections of this longest essay, History of Separation. Picking up from last time, we got to infrastructure. It's basically like the kind of end of the 19th century, the very early beginning of the 20th century, when like the socialist movement had gained a lot of power for themselves, and they had managed to kind of like effectively like build a lot of trade unions in like shop floors, and they had kind of they had like a good movement going, a good amount of momentum going. They had won some like, I guess, small rights for themselves, although I guess that wasn't really them. That was more like the bourgeoisie, like working on behalf of the working class. But yeah, they had basically like built up some infrastructure for themselves in the early decades of the uh, workers movement. Basically, they managed to go from like a bunch of peasants who were like overwhelmed by the cities, and were like, like being sucked up and chewed up and spat out by these like extremely dank factories, that would like just like the working conditions are like unspeakable. Um, all these peasants who are like completely like, they were speaking like different dialects. They had absolutely no familiarity with their environment. They're like small town folk who like kind of driven out of their villages, um, and kind of like had to go to the city in order to um, gain to make some money. And they're like overwhelmed by the city, and like kind of like falling into vice, and like being absolutely decimated by capitalism. They had absolutely no protections whatsoever. But the first decades of the workers movement was about kind of like uniting these people, and like forming some kind of recognition of these people as workers, and like just doing the very early work of like building like the absolute bare minimum of class consciousness, and some kind of basis in a worker's identity. Like people didn't have any concept of what that meant, or what it meant to be a worker at that very early stage. Again, they're really just peasant children who are lost in the big city. Um, so kind of picking up from there, and I guess they've like gained some power for themselves in the form of the social democratic parties, and these parties' whole strategy was to kind of like hold out in the parliamentarian play, until they managed to um, like gain 51% of the vote, at which point they could like do whatever they wanted. Like their idea at that early stage was that the industrial worker would just continue to grow, to continue to gain um, its in representation, and it would make up the majority of the population, at which point the Social Democratic Party would have total control over parliament, and they would be able to do whatever the hell they wanted. And for that reason, apparently, like these early social democratic parties pursued a strategy of abstentionism, which is basically where they didn't, even though they made up like a significant faction of the parliaments of these countries that we're talking about, the European countries that had parliaments, they would abstain from actually participating in any of the government processes because they, foresaw that they would, gain total control at some point, and they didn't need to. Anyway, where do we go from there on?
Okay, so this essay is, I guess it's continuing off from what we read last week, where it's like tracing kind of maybe the like end of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century. Some early successes of the workers' movement, because like in the first couple sections we read, like you said, like in the early days of like the factory system, the first industrial revolution, like, the period of time where Marx was writing and like the conditions that he was witnessing, it was pretty dire, where you had like these like humble peasant folk who like this was a completely alien world to them. Like they were just being like exploited and manipulated. They had like no leverage. Like the government would just kind of like was totally on the side of like the capitalists who would just like, the cops or whatever the equivalent back in those days would like just go in and beat workers if they were like protesting. The factory conditions were terrible. The workers were mostly like pitted against each other. There wasn't really much of a workers' movement to speak of. And this begins to change a bit with the second industrial revolution, where based on my knowledge of history, I think that's when workers started to get a bit of leverage. You had more skilled factory workers, where like they were starting to get the hang of like the factory system, like they were getting better at it, more efficient at it. They were taking on more valuable roles, where like, most workers working in factories actually had like distinct abilities that they had trained and developed that they were particularly good at. And not only that, they had all in general gotten better at working together as like a cohesive, like a mega machine, I guess, like where this Mumford would describe it. So there was this feeling, I think, early on in the 20th century that like the workers' movement was on the upswing, and that they could do this like sort of absent, whatever that word is he said, that they could just sort of like bide their time, and like the population of skilled workers would grow and grow, and they would become ever more cohesive, and they'd be like more and more of like the productive labor in society, and that eventually they wouldn't even have to stage a revolution. It would just happen organically. Like the Workers' Party would just by default be the majority party in like all of these industrial nations. So to that end, like I think early on in the 20th century, there was this promotion of like a class consciousness identity. Like they wanted to create this sense of unity between the workers. They wanted to dissolve all of like these old identifiers that like created separation and tension between workers. Like, it wasn't even so much like, oh, you're black, I'm white, like, we're enemies. Like it was like even more pronounced back then. It was like, oh, I'm from this village in this part of England, you're from that village in that part of England, so like we don't get along because we speak two like completely incomprehensible dialects of like English. So like the early workers movement put a lot of effort into trying to like dissolve that, to try to create like this normative identity based around like the skilled worker, like this sort of, it's like heavily based around like heterosexual white male worker identity that was kind of like held up as like the aspirational value for everyone. This was promoted as like something that you would identify with. You would let go of your old identity as like, a peasant farmer from bumfuck nowhere. And like you would, sorry, so like this was like a large part of their project. And also, as the workers' movement began to gain some actual leveraging power, they recognized that in order to be able to negotiate with like the capitalists and with the government, they kind of had to keep their end of the deal. They had to like make sure that their workers would actually like adhere to the agreement that the union bosses made. So like, this is where you start to see things where the heads of the unions do things that aren't necessarily in the interests of the individual worker. Like they're coming down against like scabbing, like when workers are like going on strike, it might be in the interests of certain individual workers to keep working for extra pay. And like the union bosses wouldn't be able to allow things like that because that, went against the workers' cohesion. Anyways.
Right. Yeah, which I think is like a important theme in these early years of the growth of the workers' movement is that, basically, even from these early years, the workers' movement is becoming reactionary. It's kind of like internalizing um, like reformist ideology and like reformist policies into its core in the form of like these policies that would go against individual workers, but you could even say go against the working class more generally, not in a case of scabbing, but I think there are other examples they give about how like the workers like have to go to work. They can't really oh yeah, especially around the war, for example. Like that was a big one for me. A major thing that I learned in this essay is that the workers movements were very much in support of the war efforts, like the Second World War. Which is a bit surprising, but they were in support of it because like there's a lot of work to be done, which would increase the power of the workers, presumably. Um, and yeah, which is like a pretty weird thing to think about, I guess. Um,
They do get into something like, as time goes on with the workers' movement, obviously, if you look at the trajectory of the 20th century, like at a certain point, like it was no longer the case that like the percentage of like, skilled factory workers as being like the primary employer. This was not what was happening. This is like what initially seemed like was going to happen in the early days of the workers' movement. Like just more and more people would be like some sort of skilled worker. But like with increased automation and like with, robots doing things over time, first you see that like there's a decrease in like the percentage of the population that are like skilled factory workers. You have more and more like office workers and service workers and things like that. And then eventually, especially in like places like North America, you see like an absolute decline where it's not just like, a smaller percentage of growing population. It's like actually like less total people than there were before working in factories because more of it's just being done by robots. So in order to address this, like a lot of these like workers parties that wanted to have some sort of like, majority power in society started to like maybe dilute their initial vision. Like they were reaching out to other groups that weren't necessarily like factory workers to try to get them on board. But as they did that, like as you're extending out to more and more different groups with like different sort of interests and different demands and like different motivations, it's harder and harder to have like a clear cut like vision of what it is you're actually trying to achieve, just beyond some sort of vague like, oh, we're going to make life better for like people all over. So it like loses some of its revolutionary force like implicitly. But then also as like the movement's gaining power and is like becoming integrated into like the governmental system as such, like it more explicitly loses its revolutionary potential because it's like no longer like as motivated by the idea of revolution as it is by like the idea of like working with and negotiating with the existing power structure. So like what they describe in these two sections, I think, is like a process of like a gradual like devanging of like the movement as they just kind of become integrated into the existing like superstructure.
right. Yeah. And then um, even as that's happening, like in Russia and China, you have uh, these revolutionary movements that are pursuing like big push industrialization, as they characterize it, which kind of it's able to, it doesn't like directly sell out the workers movement as like a kind of revolutionary abolition of private property or whatever, but it does kind of like they call it like an anti-Marxist Marxism. They kind of they trace this big push industrialization, which we all know as like the like very rapid industrialization pursued by like Stalin and Mao in Russia and China. You know, going from like these semi-feudal societies that had like the majority of the population were peasants who are concentrated in agriculture, but then over the course of like a very short amount of time they became like major like industrial powerhouses by just like bending these huge populations to like these just very singular purposes. But Endnotes kind of attribute that theoretically to Mr. Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. It's not somebody that I've heard of before, but here's a quote. Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, in essence, discovered the possibility of big push industrialization based on his analysis of Marx's reproduction schemes. He developed his findings into a new sort of anti-Marxist Marxism, catch-up development via central planning. Thus, in an emerging communist bloc, the figure of the technocrat planner came into its own. However, setting up a technocratic planner state meant uprooting traditional agrarian relations, something old regime elites, as well as many peasants, would bitterly oppose. Marxism developmentalism thus depended on getting rid of the old elites and reorganizing life in the countryside. Compromises were no longer an option. Anyway, the idea here is that even as like in kind of Western Europe and North America, like the workers' movement was becoming defanged and like becoming more and more assimilated into the infrastructure in Russia and China in the communist bloc. These um, countries that had attained communism, that had taken control of the means of that had like used a dictatorship of the proletariat to abolish the bourgeoisie, whatever. um, they were doing this like very strange thing, this kind of anti-Marxist Marxism, where they would like kind of under the control of the Communist Party accelerate the bourgeois revolution that had not really been attained yet in those societies. Like the whole Marxist kind of like transitionary phase theory is that you go from that you need like the bourgeoisie to do their technological revolution, become in control of society, and build up the forces of production within capitalism until such time as you could actually, you know, um, do a communist revolution and then also have the productive forces to take care of everyone and to do all the agriculture and whatnot. But because that first stage of building up the productive forces within capitalism had not been done in these semi-feudal societies, um, you had like these kind of communist parties like artificially um, doing their own like highly accelerated bourgeois revolution where they wouldn't actually like give full control of they wouldn't like allow the free market to take control of the country, but they would kind of like direct the labor of their populations into industry, into these like very particular areas that they were concentrating on, which is again industry, heavy industry. um, and then also they do like other things like they talk about how they like suppressed prices or like inflation to the point that was like presumed to like be what it would be like in the future, so they kept prices down artificially, um, and all this stuff. So yeah, that's like another kind of like weird route that the
Yeah.
workers movement took. It's like on one hand, in the kind of like Western countries, it becomes defanged and assimilated into the into like the regime, into the order of things. And then on the other hand, in the Eastern Bloc, it took this kind of like anti-Marxist route. I mean, I think that's a bit of a like an ungenerous framing of it. I mean, to call it like an anti-Marxist Marxism. Um, but yeah, there are plenty of ways that you could criticize the kind of like a push for industrialization
Yeah.
in Russia and China. But I mean, at the same time, they had to do what they had to do. Yeah. Like,
Yeah, that's like because I'll admit, like I've read a decent amount of Marx at this point, but I haven't had as much like experience like reading about like the history of actual like socialist and communist revolutions. So just based on like my relatively minimal cultural osmosis understanding of these movements, it does seem interesting, and it does raise a lot of questions that like the major cases of communist revolutions actually happened in like nations that were quite a bit different than like the conditions Marx was writing about as like a West European, like focused mostly on like West European nations. And they happened in a way that was like significantly different than like what he predicted as like the trajectory of the revolutions. Now, based on the way you describe it, it doesn't necessarily sound like it's anti-Marx. It just sounds like, I think, kind of like what I was saying earlier, like the theory works. It's just that there was all these other factors, all these other potentialities that maybe Marx didn't include in his initial analysis, that, like these additional points of consideration and possibility that could be brought into the analysis. But
right.
he wasn't really aware of them because they had to like play out historically before you could really articulate like, oh, right, okay, I guess that could have happened, because
Yeah.
it did.
I think what's really interesting about the Russian and the Chinese case is how they place so much stock in Marx's like theory that you really had to go through capitalism in order to be able to do socialism. You had to build up the productive forces in order to like actually able to do a communist revolution. Like Russia and China put so much emphasis on that that they like had to like kind of retrofit it into their kind of weird situation that didn't like precisely fit that. So they had to kind of like artificially go through that phase. They thought it was so important and so necessary that they kind of like yeah, had to like figure out a way in order to go through capitalism, but from within a post-capitalist communist revolution, which is kind of interesting to think about. Um, the other thing that I'll say is that Mao kind of had a theory for why, at least, I think you can kind of extend it to Russia, but he had a theory for why the revolution was able to happen in China, which is not something that Marx predicted. Is he called it like he characterized the Chinese people as poor and blank. So because they were just a bunch of peasants who had really been like the social formation in China. Like China is a very ancient
Mm.
um, civilization. It's fucking old as hell. Like its culture is extremely old. It's thousands and thousands of years old. Um, and like the social formations have not really changed significantly for like you could say millennia. Like it's been the same kind of thing for thousands of years of like the same kind of like stratification within the peasantry. Like you have the lower peasantry, the middle and the upper peasantry. You have like the landlords. It's basically been the same kind of like distribution of power and the same kind of social formations for millennia. So, um, and that was kind of like an advantage because like the peasantry, which is like the vast majority of the population, um, were poor and blank. They were not kind of like they're kind of these like blank slates that were not like susceptible to being corrupted by bourgeois ideology in the same way that a society that had gone through capitalism were. They could like move directly into communism and um, into the kind of like collectivistic kind of spirit of laboring together and kind of like surrendering. He also used it as a justification for why the state should be able to like take so much from the peasantry and give so little back. But yeah, like because they're like poor and blank, they were like less, prey to like bourgeois ideology and less kind of like susceptible to I don't know, corruption, I guess. So that is why I guess the revolution that happened in China, at least according to Mao, is because they're like a more pure people in their ignorance. Well, I kind of like this little discussion of anarcho-syndicalism and council communists. As communizers, as a de facto communizer podcast, we kind of have to recognize our affinity to council communism. I don't know this. I don't know if you know this, Owen, but communization theory and council communism are both like two like weird, ultra lefts, communists, theoretical tendencies that are very closely affiliated with each other. So we kind of have to do our due diligence here and like recognize the council of communism here. But they're talking about how like the problem with the workers' movement in its like parliamentarian form in these kinds of like Western European countries, where the movement was concentrating on like on waiting until the point that the industrial worker made up like 51%, 50 plus 1% of the population, and then they could have like a majority control of the government. That's what the workers' movement was waiting on. That's what they're focusing on. However, the council communist kind of like anarcho-syndicalist kind of view on things is, I think, it's like really interesting and like important to think about it. But basically, like in that global or like kind of like overall kind of perspective, the industrial worker does not have a majority share of the vote or whatever. However, if you go to like a particular kind of place or like locality or any kind of like particular context, you'll find that there were sites in which the industrial worker did have that majority share, and you can see how like you'd get like an ideology called council communism or like anarcho-syndicalism from that. It's like in these particular sites, like the worker has the majority share of the population or whatever. So why should you wait for like why should you be determined by like the national context when in your particular context you already have the means or like the political power necessary to like do what you need to do, you know what I mean? So like the council communists and the anarcho-syndicalists, even while the kind of like rightist tendencies and the centrist tendencies of the workers' movement were kind of like doing abstentionism or like kind of like being assimilated into like the kind of bourgeois regime. The kind of like left wing of the workers' movement was saying that like we already have control of these particular areas, so we should like take control of them, and they can be like kind of like little mini communist utopias or whatever. They can kind of be like mini workers states. And yeah, I think it's pretty interesting idea. It's pretty cool.
As you're describing it, like so like instead of like just waiting until they could get like the universal or like the full nation like or the continent or whatever to be communist, like they would instead just focus on like, okay, we got this like town that's
we
like
got town, we got a neighborhood, we got a factory, we got an industry, we have like I guess like the kind of like context that we're talking about would vary in different ways.
Yeah.
like if you want to say it's like a geographic thing, or if it's like a kind of like industrial thing, if it's like I mean, I don't really know too much about it, so we have to figure this out. But it would you could kind of like carve it up in different ways. Like you could say
Yeah.
it's like a town that is like 50 plus 1% majority kind of like industrial worker, or you could say that like this particular industry, which is like spread across multiple towns, has this majority of. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I guess it would be more like geographic, but I feel like there are probably other ways that you could carve it up
Mm.
beyond like spatial. Um,
Okay, this does sound really interesting. I'm gonna have to research this further. Like, it sounds like there is some interesting ideas to be extracted from that because, like, I think, like, again, like, as you're saying, like, it seems like naturally it would be like a geographic, like, division, but perhaps there are other ways to do that. I feel like maybe there's some interesting new perspectives that these ideas could take in, like, the age of the internet, where you can see, like,
yeah,
relatively small groups that might be like geographically like dispersed, and yet they have like sort of a community. Like, I don't know, I'm just thinking, is there some sort of like interplay between the idea of like decentralized like technology and like a
yeah. I
decentralized
mean,
communism?
if you think about like a given like huge tech employer like perhaps Google or Amazon, there are international companies that employ people in different countries, but in basically the same line of work. So, you have these Amazon fulfillment centers scattered across the entire planet. And perhaps in like the United States, perhaps in a given state, perhaps in like a given Amazon fulfillment center, you don't have enough people on board with a union drive in order to actually like push for a union and unionize. Like you need 50 plus 1%, 50% plus one of the um, you know employed people there to sign a union card in order
Mm,
to be able to like be legally protected in most cases, at least in Canada. That's how it works. um, but maybe if you like think internationally or something, then you could open up a new thing there. Like you have enough people in this same industry, but spread across the planet who are united, they could still effectively mobilize because, as we've seen reading endnotes, like these industries are tied together. All of their international operations are, part of one machine unit, one kind of hydraulic capitalism.
mm,
So if you fuck with production at one stage of the operation or at one location, then it will affect the entire operating, um, the entire like operation. So you could effectively like mobilize people internationally, even if you can't effectively mobilize everyone in one
yeah.
limited context. I don't know. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for joining us on this adventure. That's been your footnotes for notes this week. Go to the Patreon, give us a few bucks a week if you feel like it, if you want us to do more, if you want us to get to the point where we start reading Dutch Council Communist texts, then
Yeah.
go to patreon.com/the inverted form. Give us a few bucks a week, and
Throw
we'll
out some
put it
coins.
towards like hard to find books.
Get on our Discord server, because like maybe then we'll start like a reading group or something. We'll have some
Yeah.
fun group
Also, yeah.
activities.
If you want to read Dutch shit with us, if you want to tell us specifically which texts, which council communist or anarcho syndicalist texts we should read,
Mm.
then you can do that um, on our Discord server. If you want to read them with us, then we're down for that as well.
Yeah.
All you have to do is DM me in some way. I'm sure you can figure out a way. I mean, in the link to this, if you're watching on YouTube, I have many different social medias linked. You know, I've got a Reddit account. I've got a Letterboxd account. I have a Twitter account. You can follow me on Twitter at the inverted form. My DMs are open. Get in touch there.
Yeah. I have a website, world3.tk. I'm not on any social media. My website's pretty bare bones right now. It just says my albums on it. I make electronic music. I'm gonna try to add some stuff to it in the first third of this year, because I have some actual physical media coming out. I'm gonna be releasing a cassette and a vinyl in Pisces season around my birthday.
Wow.
Oh shit, I just revealed my astrological sign. No.
I think everybody already knew. This is a very
Everybody knows
watery
the
podcast.
Pisces. Yeah, that's true. We need to get a Cancer on here to complete the trifecta.
Yeah.
If any Cancers are listening to this and want to be the third co-host,
Yeah.
give us a ring.
If that wasn't clear, I'm a Scorpio, so it's a water podcast.
Yeah, it's Karl Marx and Taurus.
Yeah,
for those
that
of you
makes sense.
keeping score.
Just look at the size of his beard. Of course, he's a Taurus.
Probably all full of crumbs and cookies.
Ew! No, he's a Taurus. He's very well groomed. He's definitely full of crumbs. Tauruses like love their shit.
Didn't Karl Marx have to auction off his pants one time because he couldn't pay rent? He took his pants to a pawn shop. I'm sure that
he took that very hard.
This is like the sacrifices that the man made for the cause. He probably had some pants.
Some hipster like beard oil that he was applying, you know.
I can see it.
All right, so patreon.com/theinvertedform, at the inverted form on Twitter, Discord. It's there, just get in touch, and we'll see you next time.
See you next week, folks.
Bye.
Bye.